Some ISOs are better than others, and it doesn't necessarily always just mean a lower ISO is better than a higher one. What I've done is a little video test to show you the noise that you get from different ISOs on the Canon 5D Mark II, and it's looking at actually how there's 4 better ISOs than other ones. You may, if any of you are already into like filming noise and all that kind of stuff, you'll know this already, but if you don't, there's the best ISO options to choose from are 160, 320, 640 and 1250, and it's those ISO settings are better than the ISO settings a third or even 2/3 below in terms of the amount of noise that you see in an image. So what I've done is I've done a simple video here, which I'll put up straight after, just shot in the car, and I've changed the ISO and I've changed the aperture so that the exposure is exactly the same. And we're just looking, and then I zoom it into 300%. So again, you'll only really see this effect on a full 1080 viewing of this, only watching it on 1080. And what I can say is that at the lower ones, it's hard to see the difference. At 320, is it better than 250? Very difficult to tell. 640 again, is it better than 500? There is if you look really closely and over. But the big one, which I'd definitely say is quite a surprise in how much better it is ISO 1250, how that is better than ISO 1000. And from, you know, it's actually quite obvious. And then at the end, I also just throw in ridiculous ones, 2500, 6400, which is a mess. And then the high one rating where I had to have the aperture at f22, and then you can start seeing all the dust on the actual lens. So it's like, ooh, don't want to use that. But then just after that, I do it kind of side by side, or not side by side, but like a flashing shot after shot for you to really look at the difference there. I didn't take away any of the vibration, because sometimes I think if you take away the vibration, it will have to do interlacing or do some sort of stuff that would potentially affect the noise performance. But if you didn't know about this, try it yourself, try it in your own cameras. It seems like there are native ISOs which are better than other ISOs around it. And on the Canon 5D Mark II, 160, 340, 160, 320, 640, and 1250. No, 1250. 1250. So here, just have a look at it and see what you think, and hope it helps. Bye-bye.
First shot here is shot at ISO 160 at 50th of a second, 30 frames a second at f2.8, so as bright as it could get at the proper shutter speed. So now we've gone a full stop more in ISO, so we're up to 320 ISO, and the aperture has been decreased by a whole stop, so we're at f4 here. So it should be exactly the same exposure, however the noise may be a little bit higher. Now I've changed both of these down a third, so here we're at ISO 250 and we've taken the aperture to f3.5, so both a third of a stop down, so it should be exactly the same exposure. However, this lower ISO may have more noise. Now this one, we're at ISO 640, this is where noise should definitely be coming into being visible. And we're at f5.6, so it should be, again, the same exposure. Now I've lowered the ISO to ISO 500, and we've changed the aperture to f5, so again, same exposure. However, although this is a lower ISO, let's take a closer look at the noise in the shadows. And finally, here we're at 1250 ISO, and we've changed the aperture to f8, so that it should still be exactly the same aperture, exactly the same exposure. However, this is quite a high ISO, so there should definitely be noise in the shadows. However, is it better or worse than a lower ISO? So here we are, I've lowered the ISO to ISO 1000, and we're now at f7.1, so we're both a third of a stop down, a lower ISO. However, how does this compare to the higher ISO of 1250? Okay, here's a really high ISO, it's 2500 and we're at f11, so this is probably just looking at how bad the ISO noise performances in the corners. Then here's the crazy ISO of 6400 ISO, and we're at f18 now. So that's probably going to cause some lens image issues just being at that small an aperture. But this is an example of how bad the ISO gets at the top end. Or here is even high 1, which is disastrous, at f22. It's been decreased by a whole stop, so both a third of a stop. We're at f4 here, so it should be exactly the same exposure. However, the noise may be a little bit high. This lower ISO may have more noise. 140. This is where noise should definitely be 100, and we've changed the aperture coming into being visible to f5. So again, same exposure. However, at f5.6, so it should be again. Although this is a lower ISO, and the same exposure. Let's take a closer look at the noise in the shadows. Aperture to f8. So both it should still be a third of a stop down. Exactly the same aperture. It's exactly the same. A lower ISO, however, exposure. However, this is quite a high ISO. How does this compare to the higher ISO of 1000? There should definitely be noise in the shadows. However, we're at f11, so this is probably just looking at how bad the ISO noise performance is in the corners, because some lens image issues just being at that small an aperture. But this is an example of how bad the ISO gets at the top end. 1, which is disastrous, at f22.